Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We want to thank you for joining us this evening, both in person and online, for tonight's program celebrating the 35th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, sponsored by both the Interiors Committee and the Design for Aging Committee at the AIA New York chapter. I'm Stephen Jacklich, principal at Jacklich Gardner Architects and co-chair with Susan Link of the AIA Interiors Committee. Before we get started, please take a moment to either silence your cell phones or mute your screen as is appropriate. I'd also like to get started by thanking some of the very many people who have helped shape tonight's program. Barbara Weinrag of the Interiors Committee, a former co-chair, who conceived and initiated this program originally, has shaped each subsequent event. We'd like to thank members of the Interiors Committee for their continued support of these now annual events on accessible design, particularly Yutaka Takura and Carolyn Cirillo, who have each worked on every panel since 2020 and have devoted many hours of their time pulling these together. As topics as complex as the American with Disabilities Act involve many broad topics, we have partnered with many other committees from the AIA over the years, specifically the Social Science and Architecture Committee, the Housing Committee, and this year with the Design for Aging Committee. And we wish to thank Salmata Kaba of the Center for Architecture and the many staff of the AIA for their ongoing assistance in organizing tonight's event. We'd like to take a note that we were encouraged to apply for an AIA Committee Excellence Grant by Suzanne Mex and others to support this particular event, which marks the 35th anniversary. Receiving the grant has allowed us to provide for many of the communication systems you see here tonight, including ASL interpreters and real-time captioning. We're very proud of this commitment on the part of the AIA New York to accessible and equitable design. Given both the 35th anniversary and our current political climate, I would argue that it's worthy to give a very brief summation about the ADA and our series on accessible design. And sometimes it's worth asking simple questions. What is the ADA and how did it come to pass? Simply, it is a landmark piece of civil rights legislation passed in 1990 that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities and goes beyond any previous legislation in what it covered, including mental as well as physical impairments. It affects directly or indirectly almost every single person living in the United States. Most people, or many architects, unfortunately only know one or two aspects of the legislation, primarily that which concerns mobility, but it's just one of the many categories of protection under the ADA. The legislation is built upon many decades of advocacy, including the 1964-65 Civil Rights Act, the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, as well as the AIDS crisis. To borrow from a column published in 1992 by Arlene Meyerson entitled A Movement Perspective, the history of the ADA did not begin on July 26, 1990, at the signing ceremony at the White House. It did not begin in 1988 when the first ADA was introduced in Congress. The ADA story began a very long time ago in cities and towns throughout the United States, when people with disabilities began to challenge societal barriers that excluded them from their communities, and when parents of children with disabilities began to fight against the exclusion and segregation of their children. It began with the establishment of local groups to advocate for the rights of people with disabilities. It began with the establishment of the independent living movement, which challenged the notion that people with disabilities need to be institutionalized, and which fought for and provided services for people with disabilities to live in the community. That aspect of living in the community is an incredibly valuable feature of the ADA, and is one that our panels have examined each of the subsequent years that we've hosted this. And as with so much, we believe thoughtful quality design could make a meaningful difference in the quality of our lives. As the 30th anniversary of its passage approached, the Interiors Committee organized the first of these panels, featuring Karen Breitmeyer, and we were encouraged by success to investigate accessible design on a number of fronts shown here on this panel. It is worth noting that the legislation has continued to evolve with updates signed into law in 2009, including advances covering technology. And this leads us to this year's panel, the ADA at 35, Navigating Accessibility in the Hybrid Interior. And with that, I introduce Barbara Weinreich, who will introduce the panelists and explain the program tonight. Thank you.
So, we're all experiencing the thing that we're investigating. My name is Barbara Weinreich. Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening, both in person and online. I am an architect and an interior designer, an assistant professor of interior design at FIT, and a member of the AIA Interiors Committee. At our inaugural ADA panel in 2019, which Stefan just alluded to, we met in person in this room to discuss the work of Karen Breitmeyer. Never could we have imagined that the following year, for a panel that celebrated the 30th anniversary of the passage of the ADA, that we'd be completely online. As you may recall, because of the global COVID pandemic, daily actions were severely limited. We lived in relative isolation. Much of what we were accustomed to experiencing became physically unavailable. During that first wholly virtual ADA panel in 2020, we remarked that we now had a degree of appreciation for how those with disabilities might engage with the world. This is what it felt like to have barriers, maybe. This is what it meant to have access limited. Or perhaps this was a preferred method of contact, now available and expected. By meeting in virtual space, we were together as equals on a screen, or were we? Transcending space and time and difference. Was this the true promise of accessibility? So in the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of successes of hybrid meetings, but we've also seen many lectures, symposia, and gatherings that have been less successful. Hopefully this is not one of them. When in the virtual space, we miss things happening in person, and when we are in person, those in the virtual space are sometimes forgotten, like our other panelists. On both ends, we miss visual, spatial, and emotional cues. What do we need to do to fully benefit from the virtual and hybrid space and provide accessibility to all? Moreover, what is the nature of this thing that we have created? So tonight we're investigating how people interact with others specifically in hybrid space, the combination of physical interior space, which you are all in, and virtual interior space, which all of them are in. This time we're exploring in real time what it means to be in hybrid space and specifically how this relates to people with disabilities. We have a group of panelists, half online and half in person, to present their view of hybrid space, whether historically, technologically, or theoretically. Our panelists will each give a short presentation, and then we will have a moderated discussion followed by questions from the audience. For online participants, please put your questions in the Q&A function, and we will have someone read them out. And now I'm going to introduce our panelists, and that is here. So I'm introducing the panelists in order of their presentations. David Serlin is a professor of communication at UC San Diego, where he teaches courses on historical and cultural approaches to architecture, disability, and sensory design. His most recent book is Window Shopping with Helen Keller, Architecture and Disability in Modern Culture. He is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome, which awarded him the 2021 Rome Prize in Architecture. Mara Mills, it's right here. Mara, raise your hand. Is an associate professor and PhD director of media, culture, and communication at New York University, and co-founding director of the NYU Center for Disability Studies, a hub for public humanities and disability arts programming. Slow? Sorry. See, and that's something I have to remember. Thank you.
Thank you.
She is recently co-editor of the collections How to Be Disabled in a Pandemic and CRIP authorship, Disability as Method. Jake DeHaan is a certified professional in accessible core competencies and floats between inclusive design, marketing, branding, strategy, and digital experience design. He is a presentation specialist at Gensler in Baltimore and a co-creator and leader of ADAPT, Gensler's firm-wide affinity group for disabled and neurodivergent staff. He's helped clients like Nike and Microsoft, as well as Gensler's internal change management projects, thoughtfully address inclusion, neurodiversity, and digital accessibility. And finally, Emily Lim Rogers, say hello, Emily, is assistant professor of cultural anthropology at Duke University. She is a medical anthropologist whose work focuses on chronically ill and disabled communities and the ways they navigate bureaucratic systems through activism. Her book, Sick Work, Exhaustion, Labor, and Invisible Illness, is forthcoming from Duke University Press. Recent publications include pieces in the recent anthologies, CRIP Authorship, Disability as Method, and How to Be Disabled in a Pandemic. Okay, and with that, we're going to turn it over to David Serlin online. And there he is. Hello, David. Say something.
Barbara.
Good. Thank goodness.
Hi, Barbara. Hi, everyone.
And you share your screen, and you're advancing your own work.
I will. Before I begin, I just want to thank Barbara and the AIA for inviting not just me, but also inviting my fellow panelists as well for today's conversation. I am really grateful that in the 35th anniversary year of the signing into law of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the conversation around the ADA continues on, and it ranges in everything from how can we improve it, expand it, make it better, to how can we protect it from people who would much rather see it go away as some kind of adjunct to DEI or woke politics. And if you don't know that that is something that is very much in the sightlines of lots of people in the contemporary administration, then you haven't been paying attention, because that's exactly what's going on. My job today as the person kind of beginning this roundtable discussion, this workshop, is to kind of lay down some groundwork, not because I feel that I am an expert at what Barbara has called the hybrid interior, but because as someone who uses it nearly every day, and someone who has written historically about the relationship between disability and technology, I wanted to kind of anchor some thoughts that I know that Mara and Jake and Emily will build upon. So let me just start with a quotation that I often start with when I do work along these lines. And so just give me a second so I can share my screen. And I believe this should come up. Is that right? Okay. This is Stella Young, who passed away about 10 years ago. Stella was a journalist and activist in Australia, and among many things that she's contributed to writing about disability in the public sphere, she wrote, "No amount of smiling at a flight of stairs has ever made it turn into a ramp. Smiling at a television screen isn't going to make closed captions appear for people who are deaf. No amount of standing in the middle of a bookshelf and radiating a positive attitude is going to turn all those books into Braille." The reason why I like this particular quotation is that it challenges and presents a very particular kind of personality in a situation where very often disabled people are expected to be, which is to be the smiling, grateful recipient of technologies that are designed for them, for their use, rather than to think about them as participants in technologies and environments uh, in which they are not only participants and stakeholders, but very often designers and teachers and educators and consultants. In other words, here is a very wry way that Stella Young is trying to remind us that we, no matter where we are on the sort of spectrum from people who identify as having a disability to people who identify as non-disabled, but who are trying to be thoughtful about designing for experiences that are not like our own, that all along that spectrum, there is the possibility that people can learn from one another and can also try to create different kinds of environments so that they are not always at the, they're not always at a kind of vulnerable point to be designed for. In other words, that they can participate in the design process. I wanted to kind of put that out there from the very beginning because I think one of the ways that the hybrid interior model has come to be both an incredible opportunity, but also something that is potentially problematic in some way or another, is that it often creates a divide between those who are creating those virtual spaces and those who are using those virtual spaces. And maybe this is my own particular bias, is that no matter how well established the technological connection, no matter how robust the software, there tends to be an understanding of the physical or live or built environment as like the metropolis, the metropole, and the virtual environment as like the colony, the secondary space, the satellite. There's obviously been a lot of encouraging activity to try to breach that gap, but at least in my own experiences, there does seem to be a divide between these two. And that divide kind of replicates something that many people who identify as having a disability or may have family members that identify as having a disability, that they experience, which is this kind of uneven or asymmetrical relationship between the physical space and the virtual space. And that is something that people invested in technology, people who do design work across a range of environments and experience are trying to address in some way. Obviously, the fact that this panel exists is a way that we are collectively and individually trying to address it. But what it does is it often leaves out the historical piece. And that's something that I want to offer, which is that long before the creation of Zoom or Teams or whatever it is that you use in an institutional setting, educational setting, personal setting, and even long before the ADA, there have been any number of ways that people who live with disabilities have tried to create, if not alternative spaces, but also alternative ways of engaging with the built environment that may be helpful for us as we celebrate the 35th anniversary of the ADA, but also as we grapple with things like AI and other design opportunities / limitations that very often default to a normative as opposed to thinking broadly about what's possible. One of the recurring conversational points or recurring themes in a lot of scholarship around disability and architecture is the idea that people with disabilities from very early on realize that the built environment, the world out there, the material world, is not built with us in mind. And that is something that even the most empathic architect who doesn't identify with having a disability has to somehow confront in some way or another. But there have been many years and many examples of people creating alternatives, not only socially or even educationally, but also in terms of the built environment where they have tried to, and very often successfully, made worlds that were built by them and for them. One of my favorite examples is, this is an engraving, and what you will see are, it's a black and white engraving of men in top hats and women in long dresses. This is a late 19th century image of a cafe in Vienna, and it was known it was known at the time as a coffee house for deaf mutes. That was the way it was known. And this is a space that you could call an alternative space, a kind of counter-cultural space, if you will, because of the way that people found themselves there, and then by, I was going to say word of mouth, but in any number of ways of communicating, that there was a place for people that enabled them to not only live and congregate with other people like them in this space, which is the history of people finding each other in all kinds of spaces, but also that the environment enabled them and in fact kind of offered them this kind of spatial opportunity to communicate with each other. How people find each other, how people communicate with each other in alternative spaces, or even taking some slice of a normative space or a dominant space and making it their own, obviously long predates something like a Zoom call or some kind of software. The historian Bess Williamson has talked about this in her fantastic book, Accessible America. And one of the things that she has written about, and that's true of many of the people who those of us on the panel would cite as contributors to this conversation, about the way that a newsletter, in this case, was used by people in a community of post-polio survivors to communicate design ideas with one another. So what you're looking at here is a page from something called the Toomeyville Junior Gazette, and it was published in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And in addition to things like poems and songs and news reports, there would often be sections where people would talk about the wheelchair ramp that they built, or that was built for them by a family member or a carpenter around the corner from where they lived. And what you're looking at here on the screen is measurements and suggestions of supplies and ways of approaching something like this. These are newsletters that function in much the same way that email or, excuse me, listservs function today, which is to distribute information within a circuit of people who know about it and know to expect it in the mail, but also these are written by the people, the very people who are the ideal recipients. So you've got something of a kind of vertical integration of people who are see problems in their environment, building those environments or attempting to build them as solutions to those problems, and then sharing that information with other people in their community. And this is another page from the Toomeyville, another issue of the Toomeyville Gazette, where someone has talked about how if you are an artist and you use a chair or you have mobility issues, a rolling easel or a hydraulic lift easel might be a very helpful item for you if you want to accomplish the goal of painting. And then a little nostalgia here, the VW microbus, when it was not associated with kind of hippie culture, which really comes in the mid to late 1960s, but in the late 50s, early 60s, it was an ideal vehicle because it could be easily rearranged and retrofitted with different kinds of appliances, in this case, adaptations that would enable someone to have a ramp that would fold down and fold up. And these are also the kinds of ideas that were shared by newsletter in the age before there were other faster communication technologies. The last few items I want to share with you, and then I will turn things over to the next presenter, Mara Mills. These are examples that weren't necessarily shared by newsletter or by word of mouth, but they were distributed by people who were interested in vernacular or homemade or DIY design that was happening in communities where there were people who had either the means to purchase or just the ingenuity to take. In this example, this is a woman who uses leg braces, who has adapted a belt and hooks from a window washer's contraption, and enables her to not only stand at the sink and wash dishes, but there are other photos in this series where she is bathing her baby. And so that belt gives her the kind of physical security that she needs to avoid falling and accomplish domestic tasks. And these coexisted, obviously, with, in the 1950s and 1960s, the dream kitchens that were kind of the fantasies of interior designers and people who were building, suburban tract houses like Levittown. That these things coexist might be considered a way of thinking of histories of disability and architecture as kind of this hybrid between what we already know and what we might benefit from knowing if we know a little bit more about our own histories as not only people with disabilities, but people who are interested in design. The last image that I want to share with you is one that goes to the heart of my recent book, where I use the metaphor of Helen Keller window shopping, which she did a lot of. She loved walking up and down Fifth Avenue and with a friend or a secretary who would describe things to her in the windows. She loved Henri Bendel's shop in particular. I wanted to end with her because here is a great example of a hybrid design that is customized to the experience of the person. This is a photo of Helen Keller, who is standing on her property. In 1938, she moved to Easton, Connecticut, where she lived for the rest of her life, having lived for about 20 years in Queens, which is an aspect of her life a lot of people don't know. She was a denizen of Forest Hills, so she liked the good life. And Helen is leaning backwards somewhat on her left arm, which is touching a railing. And this isn't just a fence. This is actually a railing that was built for her by a local carpenter, and it goes 1/4 mile around her property, so that by herself, independent of others, she could take a morning constitutional. And this is a photo of her just outside of her house that was custom designed for her as well. And I like this quotation that I'll close my comments with, and it's something that she wrote in 1951. Every waking moment that I am not occupied with a lecture or an interview, my soul speeds home to the walk by a cedar railing where I have communed with the morning and listened with my hand on the trees as the winds make the music in their branches. And the point here is not just this kind of very beautiful rural image of Helen Keller walking on her property, but that it's through a cedar railing that enables her to both live in a kind of dominant environment like that of a house, albeit one designed for her in the 1930s, and to have her own space, have the kind of freedom of movement that would enable her to kind of have an independent experience, and one that was very fully invested not just with not what she was seeing or hearing, but what she was taking in terms of smell, touch, and the kind of full-on embodied experience of what it means to move through the world. So those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about in terms of hybrids, and I will be very curious to know what others on the panel and then other people in the audience have to say to contribute to this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, David. This is Mara, Mara Mills. I think I can click into my, oh, no, I'll click through David's. So let me describe myself, which is an access technique, not just for the hybrid world, but for any kind of event. I'm a short, barely peeking over this podium, white middle-aged woman with a very messy brown curly hair up in a bun wearing a black shirt. Basically, that's almost always my description because I almost always look exactly the same. I was so delighted to be invited to this and to know that there was an event happening on hybrid interiors and accessibility. Partly because, as you heard in my bio and Emily Lim Rogers' bios, we and a group of about 20 other New Yorkers, mostly disabled and neurodivergent New Yorkers, just finished a book, How to Be Disabled in a Pandemic. It just came out 2 months ago from NYU Press, about the impact, or I should say impacts plural, of the pandemic, by which I don't just mean the virus, I mean city policies, zip codes, jobs, institutionalization, access to hybrid tools or not, on different disability communities in New York. Disability is a vastly internally diverse category, and in a way, we should have done more theorization of hybrid interiors in that book. The opening chapter is about Rikers and about disabled people at Rikers who had no access to the internet or any sort of hybrid techniques at a moment when not just communication out, but information coming in would have been incredibly important for safety purposes in early 2020. So I'm going to give a brief talk. We all have about 8 minutes, and I think you'll get a sense between David's talk, my talk, and Emily, whose work I also know quite well, and Jake, who I just met, of some of that internal diversity. The things I'm going to say, I think, even might conflict or have friction with the things you'll say, Emily, and that is disability culture, that kind of access friction, to quote a wonderful scholar, Amy Hamrai. So if David is a historian of architecture, I'm a historian of telecommunications. So you're going to get that piece of the hybrid interior from me. And I want to make 2 points in my 6 to 8 minutes. One is that if disabled people and particular disability communities have been at the forefront of many innovations in architecture and also in remote access, telecommunications-based access, and hybrid work and sociality, as David suggested a bit in his talk, those innovations themselves are often inaccessible for other disabled people. New access technologies created for one disability community need to be revised to make them accessible for other disability groups. So in the history of telecommunication, we see a constant dialectic between access and inaccessibility. And I'll give you a very concrete example with a few points on a timeline of that. And then my second point is that remote access innovations created by disabled people or supposedly on behalf of disabled people often become taken up into mainstream corporate media infrastructures. after the invention and innovation stages. You often have these invention stories about something being invented for a disabled person or group, but once it becomes taken up into corporate media, that origin story is usually forgotten, and the original user group can even be shut out of the commercial version of the technology, either for financial or access reasons. So in this really short talk, I'm just going to give you the example of deaf innovations in telecommunications to explain those 2 points, namely this iterative process over the last century of deaf telecom users being repeatedly excluded from the very tools they helped to create. The photo that I have on my cover slide is from 1972 from the University of Utah. It's a photo of a man named David Mortensen, black and white photo, sitting at a teletype machine, which some people have described as like an early version of email. Teletype has a much, much longer history than this, 100-year history, and deaf people were using it for those entire 100 years. So my first slide, I just want to start by mentioning a really important new resource, just launched a couple of months ago. My center had a launch party for it. It's in the beta stage, called Remote Access Archive. It was launched by the Critical Design Lab, a very big team directed by Amy Hamrai at Vanderbilt. I believe Amy will soon be at York, Canada Research Chair, I think. This slide has the Critical Design Lab website on it, and it has a photo of the main page. The photo itself, I'll read their image description, is a screenshot of a Zoom shared screen, which shows a work of art by Yo-Yo Lin, Y-O-Y-O-L-I-N. The art is a white and gray blob against a black background. The bottom shows a series of gray buttons, along with an orange chat button that is lit up. A speech bubble above it says, "From Dominica, D-O-M-I-N-I-K-A, to everyone, yes, same issue with audio." They have this as their front page of their website because it shows that even in a remote access archive documenting remote access tools across time for disabled people, inaccessibility and access friction are always present. So they have this little pop-up like, I can't access the audio on their remote access screenshot, which is from a remote access party they were throwing during a series that they threw during the pandemic, which many of us attended. They were super fun. So the second screen is from the same remote access archive website homepage, where they basically explain what this resource is. Because it's beta, you will have to go to this page and write to them to get access. It's an amazing archive. To just read from the screen, it documents the ways disabled people and communities have used technology for remote forms of participation before and during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. It's crowdsourced, community-based archive. And the term remote access describes learning, working, socializing, and organizing with other people in different places. In our digital era, remote access is very common, but this was not always the case. On the right, they have a sidebar where you can't see the whole thing, but they describe ways they make this remote access archive accessible because it's not intrinsically accessible. So they have a plain language version, they have alt text, captions, video descriptions for the video files. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of items of remote access created, mostly telecom-based, but also cassette tape collectives and mail, school by mail, all sorts of examples in this fantastic archive. So I bring this up because I don't have time to give you lots of examples, but you can go here and see like an abundant history of disability and remote access. Some of it architectural, some pen and paper, media-based. My own research has mostly focused on the history of telecom in the US, specifically the work of Bell Labs and the Bell system, AT&T. It was a legally sanctioned monopoly controlling most of telecom in the US through the 1980s, where engineers not only developed a nationwide telephone system, but a lot of the tools that give us computing, the internet, things we think of when we think of hybrid interiors on the telecom side today. So microphones, sound film, transistors, early television, the picture phone, which was proto-Zoom, and much, much, much more. That all came out of AT&T's Bell Labs. Working in the AT&T archives, I repeatedly observed what I came to call in 2010 an assistive pretext. And I just have a text-based screen here with a quote about what assistive pretext means. I'll summarize it. Basically, disabled people, and especially in the case of AT&T, deaf people, very internally diverse category. I'm a hearing person. I'll just say deafness and deaf people, very internally diverse itself, were asked over and over again by engineers to be test subjects, or they were used as thought experiments, or they were used as advertisements for new technology, or they were asked to use prototypes or be early adopters of technology when it had either a high price point or no other obvious user group, only to have those same deaf people be abandoned by AT&T financially again, or in terms of access, as more profitable markets opened up. Like across, I can give you 400 examples of this from that one corporation. I'm just gonna give you a few because I don't have a lot of time. So just to explain what I mean, we can really start most famously with the invention of the telephone itself. Alexander Graham Bell's company, its long-distance branch, became AT&T, which then became this monopoly, with Bell Labs being, as many of you know, this. My mother was a telephone operator, so I don't romanticize Bell Labs at all. We celebrated when the monopoly broke up, but they have more Nobel Prizes than any other unit in the United States, any university. It is the history of American technology in a lot of ways. So I'm not romanticizing Bell here at all, but let me just say the invention of the phone, which after the telegraph was the first telecom device that automatically converted a sensory phenomenon into an electrical signal. The telegraph required coding. The phone didn't. It's the beginning of a lot of things we think of as remote access now. Many people know the story of Alexander Graham Bell, an oralist, teaching deaf students to speak orally, very controversial. He created a device pictured on this slide in black and white called the ear phonautograph to teach his deaf pupils. It's sort of gruesomely a photo of a severed eardrum on something that looks like an old microscope stand. But basically it held a stylus and would inscribe sound waves onto a plate of sooted glass. He thought this would help his students to read speech. While doing that, he was experimenting electrically. He was also an experimenter, and he realized he could undulate an electrical signal using a similar kind of membrane, and whatever. This is the myth. It's partly true. Invented the telephone. Let me just keep it short. Anyway, as telephony became not only an invention that worked for a few people, but a ubiquitous device in the United States, like, to quote B. Ruby Rich, a requirement of citizenship. You know, you have to have a phone, you had to have a phone number to go to school, to get a social security number, everything, to pay your taxes for a while. It opened, you know, for some people, the phone opened up home remote access, to use that word anachronistically, but it created an enormous citizenship problem for deaf people because they couldn't use the telephone. So it was this horrible irony. And years followed at Bell Labs of attempts to make visual telephony available. I have one photo here from 1943 of a woman named Harriet Green and a deaf man named Edgar Bloom experimenting with something that became the sound spectrograph. There's too much to say about that to say much more, but there were dozens of experiments, almost all failed, not enough money put into them to make visual telephony a possibility because of the huge problem, the origins of this company and the huge problem they created for deaf people whilst using them in their advertisements all the time about the origin of the phone. Another example, some of the first work on television was also completed at Bell Labs in the 1920s and 30s. This is a photo of a two-way television test booth. There's a chair, you see like a semi-soundproof room with speakers and a tiny person's face in the middle. Not surprisingly, in the AT&T Bell Labs space, they imagined television to be a telecom technology. They thought it would be two-way, not broadcast. The first tests that they ran and the first public demonstrations of this, what they called an iconophone, happened here in New York with a group of deaf lip readers. And they were using the lip readers, this team, to test the clarity of the screen, the visual clarity of this cathode ray-based screen. To go to my next slide, as we know it, TV took a totally different path. It became a broadcast medium. And after World War II, again, a nearly universal one, not just for, cultural phenomena, imagined community stuff, but to transmit essential government news and emergency broadcasts from which, again, deaf people were excluded. This is the assistive pretext. It's the dialectic between accessibility and inaccessibility in the engineering and telecom space that is my theme. I don't have time to give you the history of closed captioning, which solved this problem for TV, but you can read Greg Downey's book. The cover of it is pictured here. It's just a plain blue cover with text looking like captions, and it's called Closed Captioning, Subtitling, Stenography, and the Digital Convergence of Text with Television. He looks at the importance of deaf people and their advocacy, and in some cases their inventive work, to inventing captions to solve the TV problem, which they had been at the origin of helping to invent or create. Captions have now become another nearly universal tool for like endless purposes in the present. And then just to get us up to sort of proto-Zoom, I'll just say in the 60s, Bell Labs was still working on two-way TV. Now they called it the picture phone. This one was commercially, I wouldn't say successful, but adopted in cities around the country. And yeah, they still were demonstrating it with deaf lip readers. This is a photo of a 1960s era phone and sort of circular TV set with two deaf students, Laura Rabinowitz, who was 15, New York, Lexington School of the Deaf, talking to Howard Mann, age 14, via lip reading in the first demonstration, one of the first two on the first day from Grand Central Terminal to Prudential. So they still had this fantasy of finally we'll have visual telephony. The picture phone did work, like I said, but it was prohibitively expensive. Not many people used it. Ken Lipartito, Lipartito, who's a historian of technology, has written a lot about this device. He said it's one of the forgotten precursors to today's internet. We have the history of computing story. We know the DARPANET story in my world. We forget about some of these applications like the picture phone. It was meant to do, and it did for a few wealthy people, the kind of hybrid work from home that this panel is organized around. Some deaf people did use it. It was installed at Gallaudet, so not for lip reading, but for sign language. So there was a moment of visual telephony there. Here's my final slide. By the time the pandemic and school work closures in 2020 made remote access an urgent and widespread daily need, even if it had already been a technical possibility in the telecom space that I'm describing, and also in the many disability spaces in Amy Hamraoui and Critical Design Lab's archive, because disabled people have been doing remote access for a long time and have expressed frustration at not having government and financial support for it or attention to it until everyone else suddenly wanted it. But by the time remote access became ubiquitous in many work and school spaces, captions in that domain were woefully absent or far behind. even though captions had been around, as Greg Downey shows us, as a TV solution for decades and decades. So once again, we have to reinvent captions for a visual, video-based space, even though arguably deaf people were at the start of a picture phone Zoom-like device. I can tell you that in 2020, NYU switched from, I think, Blue Jeans. I'm looking at Emily Lim Rogers because we were collaborators at NYU at the time. Now you're at Duke, sadly for me. We switched to Zoom. And our center, the Center for Disability Studies, it was really hard. We had to constantly hire CART captioners who were overwhelmed with work for like every meeting and every event that we held, because there wasn't an automated caption option on that platform that we were trapped inside using by our work. Not until the end of 2020 did automated captions, that wheel, get reinvented again. So once again, deaf people were excluded from a tool, picture phones here, that they had contributed to across nearly a century. And that history has largely been forgotten, and usually in mainstream media or media histories, the story we get is of a trickle-down narrative about innovations in new teleconferencing companies, like trickling down, or a charity approach to disabled people. Look, Zoom helped automate captions, rather than the actual narrative of like decades of disabled labor, whether it's advertising or test subject labor, and like, getting radically, like sort of abruptly dumped once something becomes profitable. So this slide, I just think, is an amazing article. If you're interested, it's a picture of lots of Post-it notes with handwriting on them and pictures from an article by the deaf artist, Joseph Grigley, Grigley, called Inventory of Apologies. And he's an artist who does art with text. He had a big show at Mass MoCA recently, solo show last year. This article from 2020 in VOCA is just him collecting dozens of apologies people emailed to him for not having captions at Zoom events, most of which they had invited him to be a presenter at. And he would tell them, I am deaf, is it going to be accessible? He would show up, no, it wasn't accessible. So the whole thing is just 20 apologies from people in 2020 about not having captions. So I'll stop there with the telecom piece, and we're gonna pass it to someone on screen, to Jake, who is gonna bring us into the design space for a different angle on this.
Yeah, what Mara just shared is partially my own lived experience, because I myself am a deaf person. I was born profoundly deaf, which I'll touch upon in my presentation, which I'm pulling up right now for you folks. So, hi, I will do a visual description of myself as well. I'm Jake Dahan. I go by he, him pronouns. I'm a white male with short hair, a beard, blue glasses, and of course a very colorful shirt, because I do visual presentations for a living. And I work at Gensler, and I will talk a little bit more about my role a little bit later, but I want to talk a little high level here. You've heard some really great history, which I think is often forgotten when we're designers constantly practicing our work and constantly producing and meeting deadlines. And I just need to remind you all that great design is a lot of things, but to me, great design is inclusive. And that's really important when you're trying to design for the outliers of our society. And as a designer practicing every day, I always have to make sure I'm including people I may not understand or may not know, and include them in my work. And that actually leads into, I encourage all of you to design with communities, not for communities. And you heard a little bit about that from David and Mara already, so I'm gonna give you some of my own examples of stuff that I've done that really emulates that. And hopefully it inspires and motivates you to embody that in your own work. And this is actually a couple years old. I went to Syracuse University for industrial and interaction design. And I got to spend a lot of time in my 5th year researching things that I loved, which were 2 things. Bars. I actually was one of those kids that loved going to bars and socializing and meeting new people. And how can I merge bars with being a social environment for those who may not socialize very well in overstimulating environments? How can I change this environment to be, well, more inclusive? And so again, with the product design major, I did create this digital coaster that illuminated, it lit up, and it indicated to the room that, hey, I'm participating in the activity for the day. And one thing I wanted to hit home for this is my research was a little unconventional as well. I actually did a lot of my research via Reddit. I went on Reddit threads and I would find socially anxious or introvert or autism. And I would talk to those individuals and get pages upon pages of their own lived experience and stories. And I would weave that into my design decisions. And that is design strategy. And one thing that I always heard from the people I interviewed was at the very end, they'd say, so where is the bar going to be built? And I think that's a really important reminder that as designers, as creative as all of you are, is to remember that you're designing with these people in order to make space inclusive for them. And another thing we talked about a little bit earlier was the COVID-19 pandemic and how it was a mass disabling event. But of course, the one thing we all kind of pivoted towards was masks as a protection for ourselves and the communities we would be around. For deaf people like me and my older brother Patrick, it was everything shut down. I no longer could lip read or lean on the crutches I needed to socially survive in a pandemic. And so for us, we were like, can we take any action to make it a little bit easier for us? And we had found that there were vendors out there making accessible masks, things that were clear and were safe. We had N95 masks that we found that surgeons were using for deaf people in deaf communities already. It just wasn't done in a mainstream fashion. And so we created an online resource for transparent face coverings. And I think it was a really proud moment to see us get featured in different press releases, but it was mostly because more people were being more accessible. And it started a conversation of people being like, well, I can't see your smile. And I put air quotes on that because it's not really always about, oh, the smile we have, but rather the facial cues we then lost. We lost that when we had to cover up half our face to protect each other, but we couldn't communicate anymore. And I think this is a really important reminder to all of us to tap into that, to remember that we all went through that same period of time together, and let that reminder influence our work today, especially if we're doing hybrid spaces. And something that a mentor of mine told me recently is that, hey, you're a change maker. It may seem unconventional, but it's true, is be a change maker wherever you are and whoever you are. I know I'm an emerging professional at the world's largest architecture and design firm, and I've been there for almost 4 years now. And this you see on the screen is just a handful of, I would say about 5% of the work I've done over my 4 years at the firm so far. And for me, I started at the firm as an experienced designer working with brand, strategy, and digital experience design teams, which you heard in my introduction by Barbara. And all of these things influence my work. But what I really feel influences my work the most is digital accessibility. Because so often we talk about accessibility and the ADA as like, what is access? Just a reminder, the ADA is the basement, not the ceiling. We can do so far much better than the ADA gives us, and it should challenge us to do better for our communities. But digital accessibility often is forgotten too, because it's relatively new, and I put air quotes on that just because we listened to Mara share that technology's preceded all of this COVID-19 time that we experienced. And digital accessibility is really important. Think about, you create renderings as an architect or an interior designer, and you write up a PDF document to send to your client. How many of you go to the extra measure? Because there are steps you have to take to make that document accessible for those who use screen readers or assistive technologies. And it's so important that I've talked a lot to my colleagues at Gensler about how they can be more inclusive and accessible with their digital communications. But that's also translated over into the work I've done with Adapt, which I created with 2 others, Drew Wilson and Lily Trankova, about 3 years ago. And this is a photo of us doing a panel as our first event during Disability Pride Month last year, in our first year. And for us, we wanted to show, not tout. We wanted to give the opportunity to welcome our community in and say, we'll be vulnerable, we'll be raw and honest and authentic, and share our stories and journey with you in hopes that you'll join us. And this was about 100 people in attendance, both a mix of hybrid and virtual, in-person and virtual. And it was a really engaging dialogue that we had. And a lot of people left really motivated, empowered to continue the discussion about how can we be more inclusive to our own disabled colleagues. And in fact, last year we had a big milestone of having James Lebrecht, who is the co-director of Crip Camp, a documentary that I highly, highly recommend. I've watched it over a dozen times. I never fail to cry each time. And I know it's a great encapsulation of not just the ADA, but how it's literally a camp of disabled teens who congregated and said, we deserve better. All of us deserve better. And that's why, again, I want to remind you, and FYI, this event took, I think we had about 15 different offices in participating, and that's dozens and dozens of people really digesting this conversation with James. And one thing that came up in his conversation with one of our other co-leads was in the San Francisco office. They had done a renovation of the space, and one thing they forgot was they didn't realize, this is something they didn't realize, was that in the bathroom, when James went to use it, he did a tour of the space. And when he went to use the bathroom, a trash can was in the way for him to exit the space. And he did use this opportunity to tell that to architects and designers that, hey, just so you know that a design decision you made maybe just didn't know was an issue, now is. And it's why it's so important to have people who lived experience working with you and to integrate disabled, lived experience users into space to be able to critique it and improve it so that it is truly inherently inclusive. I'll cede my time so that Emily can share, but I'm really looking forward to a little bit of a deeper dive in the panel conversations, and thank you again for your time today.
All right. Oh, wait. Which way? I just keep going? Yeah. Okay, cool. There we go. Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Lim Rogers. I'll also self-describe. I'm an Asian transmasculine person. I'm wearing sort of yellow translucent glasses, a black sweatshirt, and a New York Liberty baseball cap. All right. So I'm come at this as a medical anthropologist and talking on the side of specifically chronic illness, which has a relationship with disability, but is also distinct in certain respects. So I specifically come at this through discussing my anthropological fieldwork. Today is what I'll discuss, specifically with people with myalgic encephalomyelitis, AKA chronic fatigue syndrome, or MECFS. One of few groups, frankly, for whom the pandemic changed very little about their day-to-day lives. Quarantine resembled much of their everyday lives before, given that the syndrome is defined by post-exertional malaise or crashes that render 1/4 of them bed or homebound. And so this presented specific issues when it came to doing traditional ideas of what anthropological fieldwork looks like, particularly spatially. So, yes, let me sort of start. I'm going to kind of hopefully give seeds of ideas to plant for our Q&A. All right. So yeah, so this meant that my ethnography, the homebounded nature of people with MECFS, meant that my ethnography had to be conducted in a hybrid way, contrary to the image of the anthropologist as an Indiana Jones type figure, rough and tumble in a far out, remote, but not in that sense, place, even though it took place before COVID. And at the time, as Mara alluded to, remote fieldwork couldn't be funded. I did hybrid fieldwork, as in I followed an MECFS activist group, both in the streets and through their mostly hybrid meetings over, at the time it was Blue Jeans, not Zoom, was sort of the more popular one. And also went to their meetings online as well as in-person actions, et cetera. And I address this in my book. This is actually a screen cap from my book to do a visual description of this image. It is a very, very cluttered bookshelf with an iMac in a tiny Brooklyn bedroom. And this was right after I had to move all my books from my office after COVID. So this is where I did it, and I didn't really like it, actually. I didn't really like doing field work from there. And so I began to think about this in terms of the kind of romanticization of remote spaces now as versus the fact that I didn't really like doing fieldwork this way. I didn't think it was a radical or innovative or novel way of doing fieldwork, but rather, as Mara alluded to, it was just the way that things had to be done for a long time. So I became interested in what this said not only about ethnographic method. I'll leave that aside for today, given that this is an audience not of anthropologists, but I will allude quickly to this piece that's in the anthology that Mara Mills co-edited called Crip Authorship, Disability as Method. So this is a piece on virtual ethnography, which had been a term for a long time, but again, came to increasing prominence when everyone had to do this thing. And everyone, that kind of idea of an everyone, always excluding disabled people or certain forms of disability or chronic illnesses, at least, has sort of been a consistent theme today. So the methods of this project, in other words, mirrored the object under investigation. So during COVID, as I mentioned, there became a glamorization of remote access. Within disability communities themselves, I think there was a little bit of historical amnesia about the fact that people didn't love this. That's what I found in my ethnography of people with ME/CFS, is that they wanted to participate in IRL spaces. So I think we need to remember that. I think we're increasingly on this kind of train of runaway train, maybe, of historical amnesia on the one hand, or the sort of seesaw is back to normal on the other hand, right? So yeah, so even when, I'm jumping around a little bit, but even when I was IRL, I experienced hybrid spaces like this one all the time. So conferences and even protests would be live streamed, and they would also be in person so that people online could access them. But I also, one of the interesting things that I saw, and I see increasingly less today, are techniques to make IRL spaces, even if hybrid, accessible to people with chronic illnesses who could make it out there. So for example, at a conference at Stanford that was a session designed to put patients with chronic fatigue syndrome in contact with researchers and physicians, there were these zero gravity lawn chair recliners, if you know the ones I'm talking about. They recline all the way back and your feet are sort of slightly at the heart level or above even. And when one of the few things that can alleviate the symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome and similar chronic illnesses like POTS, I'm not even gonna try to, I have POTS, but I don't even remember the acronym, but it's a type of orthostatic hypotension. It often is characterized by syncope and again, things that are only alleviated by remaining reclined. So people brought lawn chairs and put them in the back of an auditorium. Or I went to a conference at the NIH where people brought sleeping bags from home. And while I'm also not trying to glamorize this, I'm interested in that as a kind of spatial intervention and that as its own kind of embodiment of a type of hybrid space that I think we forgot existed, either in favor of, again, return to normal, or the remote equals accessibility. So I wanted to just kind of close by looking at, very briefly mentioning a few pieces of artwork that I think are really interesting in this regard. This one's by the artist Carolyn Lazard, and this was at the Venice Biennale in 2022. And an image description of this, it is a sort of brown lazy boy chair that's sort of hoisted up. It's almost like it's leaning forward. And these chairs can actually lean forward and backward, like almost 180 degrees, if that makes sense, to be tilted almost all the way forward or all the way back. And I find this piece interesting because it's a very kind of startling intervention into a gallery space, especially given how associated the lazy boy chair is with laziness or domestic coziness. And in fact, what's interesting is the lazy boy was actually first invented for talking on the telephone. I don't know if we've talked about this, Mara, but it was. And it reminded me, because a lot of my interlocutors in my research would zoom in on, or blue jeans in at the time, right, from their iPads on lazy boys, on recliners, right? So I just wanted to bring that image up. And then another one, which is the artist Finnegan Shannon, who's actually the cover of the anthology that I mentioned before, Crip Authorship, puts these benches into gallery spaces, in part because galleries otherwise refuse to install benches. So the access feature is the art. And so this one is a blue bench. It kind of is the shape of a wooden sort of chaise lounge that says, so it's painted bright blue, and then in white handwritten font, it says, "Here to lounge, lounge if you agree." So just a sort of other kind of spatial intervention that in and of itself almost strikes me as hybrid in this weird way. And we can talk about that more later. Not a fully teased out idea, but just some hopefully thoughts that are open-ended enough to lead us into a Q&A. Thanks for listening to this. Yeah. Do I need to change it? Okay, there's no like home slide. Okay. Sleep. Okay.
So, we can each take one.
Should I test
Is there
it?
a way to get? Is there a way also to get? There we go. Jake and David on the screen. There we are. Can you guys hear me? Good. Okay. Okay. So many things to consider. I just wanted to start actually with two comments. I really appreciate the perspective that these panelists are bringing, because I think as designers we think first about physical spaces and the problems that I'll talk more slowly, physical spaces and the problems that we are supposed to solve as designers. But what I really appreciate is learning so much about the history of people with disabilities in physical spaces that we don't consider, that we don't know about because we don't have to. And so from David's perspective of giving different examples about how people with disabilities create the physical environment that they need in order to understand their physical space. The Helen Keller image being particularly interesting in that it gave her autonomy through a physically built thing. The examples that Mara showed of the disenfranchisement of deaf people from something they helped to develop, so that this kind of technology existed for a long time. And it's only when the non-disabled community really needed to use it that we embraced it and thought, oh, this is solving so many problems now. And then Jake's perspective, which is, okay, let's get real to all of you designers, and how can you embrace this challenge to really think about how to consider all the users and not wait for them to say something isn't working for them. And to Emily saying, maybe like this isn't the answer, and you have to consider how to make the built environment better for hybrid access in terms of how do we create a physical environment that helps. So yeah, I'm ready to go home because I learned everything I wanted to know. And again, I wrote down assumptions that, remote work is the best for people with disabilities. And again, Emily, challenging that people with chronic fatigue syndrome need to use it, but maybe we should create other ways that they can participate in a space. So those are some, I'm sorry to pontificate, but I wanted to also make clear why we structured it this way, so that we looked a little bit at the history and we looked a little bit more theoretically at the notion of hybrid space instead of just a checklist of make sure you have CART, make sure you self-identify, make sure you have interpreters, all very important, but this is really a philosophical conversation as well, I think. So I'm going to actually open it up to the panelists a little bit to comment on what each other said. David, I'd like to start with you because you were a long time ago already and we all forgot what you said. But do you have, based on what you've seen and heard, do you have also comments?
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. Well, I guess I will say that I have comments for all of my kind of fellow panelists, not so much like questions, but maybe ways that could connect the fact that, you know, I started with a 19th century image and we went, you know, well into the early 21st century with the kind of images and examples that Jake and Emily were sharing. And then along the way, making the kind of parallels or connections that Mara was doing. So I guess one thing I would observe is that all four of us, in our own respective ways and our own discipline and training, one of the things that we are trying to get at is that there is a tendency or even a kind of a tendency by designers, whether they are of systems, whether they are built environments, virtual ones, of a kind of belief in what's often called or considered a new normal. In other words, we get to this place, this is seems to be the way that we're all going to not only communicate, but this is also the way that we are going to kind of institutionalize these, whether it's in a school or in a business, whether it is, you know, government or it's private sector, that now we have the means to make these hybrid spaces, this hybrid space, make it like have boundaries around it, have some kind of recognizable shape. And it seems to be the case that among people with disabilities, people who identify along various spectrums, physical, sensory, neurodiverse, that the norm is set by, or the new normal, is set by someone else. And that sometimes we have an opportunity to be involved in that process, but more often than not, because of economics, because of politics, that we are recipients, and therefore we are asked to subscribe to this idea of a new normal, as opposed to someone saying, new normal is just a fantasy. Normal is just a fantasy. So what would it be like to talk about this as an ongoing process, like an ongoing dialogue? And it just struck me that all of us in some way were talking about that, not necessarily tension, but a kind of this asymmetry between the presentation of certain kinds of spaces and the, if not resistance to, then just the kind of questioning on whose terms is this being presented or delivered as a norm. And I really like what Jake said when he said, you know, like what's often presented as the norm is like the floor, not the ceiling. You know, like we can do better. And yes, that involves the active participation of people who have more than just representational stake. They have actual, their lives are at stake. So the urgency is like really there. But it does seem that in order for us to make any forward movement, we have to really understand that those institutional or educational forces that, or technological forces that would like to say like, okay, well finally we now have this platform, finally we have that those should always be understood as in process.
I can make I guess I'll make a couple of responses. Emily, your talk made me think of two things. Seeing that photo of your workspace and then hearing about the people you have been interviewing for a decade having similar workspaces and protest spaces and community spaces and not liking it, being sick of it, makes me think of two things. One, I know people who've worked on the history of the home office. One of my former students, Elizabeth Patton, who's a professor at the University of Maryland, has a book on the history of the home office, but so there are histories out there of designed spaces to accommodate a phone, that kind of remote hybrid work. I don't actually know of recent histories of like great design for hybrid space. Instead, it is kind of like what you're saying. It's like throw Zoom at it and that the problem is solved. Like, let's rely on a big tech company and force them to follow the WCAG rules and do alt text and that sort of, and auto captions, and that's the solution to the problem. I'd love to hear what everyone here thinks about the new home office and like what great designs are out there that would be both accessible and pleasurable, if that's, because most of us are living with a similar thing to your photo of the cramped laptop, maybe in a bedroom or wherever, but or it's just whatever improvised space. The other thing I would say is your point, Emily, about is remote access as within imagination of it being telecom hybrid, preventing us from imagining new, I don't know if, I don't use the word inclusive all the time, but new inclusive spaces. And you're not the only person pushing back on this. I mean, actually, my mentor is here, Georgina Klieg, not to embarrass you, Georgina, but who's is the world expert on blind arts access. Recently retired from Berkeley, has written many, many books, and yay, lives back in New York again. And I feel like during the pandemic, Georgina, you were just constantly being asked to talk about audio description of online images for blind people. And now all you want to talk about is touch tours. And you're doing that, you know, Georgina consults for the Met, the Tate, you're doing a big talk for VNA on this. And like the turn to touch and the insistence of we don't, like, yeah, we need audio description, but also we need more physical access. This idea that like, oh, disability is solved by Wi-Fi and a laptop, it's not enough. So anyway, Emily, those are the things that your talk made me think about.
I wasn't sure if we're going in order. No. Jake, I don't know.
I'm happy to go. I was gonna circle it back to Mara's points. With the exclusion, I kind of wanted to add a new point when I was sharing about ADAPT. What we did, actually, the co-leads and I, we decided to start ADAPT as a firm-wide group rather than a localized group. Because of that exact issue of people being fearful. Okay, we're at a large organization. Gensler is 6,000 plus employees, right, across the world. And so there's this mentality that, oh, if I self-identify as disabled, oh, does that harm me? Does that harm my opportunities of growth? Does that harm my opportunities to get a promotion or get a raise or even just hold a job? And that fear is so prevalent. And something that I find really beautiful is just when you hold space. And well, that's what we did. We just set aside 2 blocks a month. And one of them is the community hours, just an hour where there is kind of no structure. People can come as they are and just talk. And once we opened that space up, it was hella awkward to begin with. I'll be transparent with you. People didn't speak up. People were like, what do we do? And so we just had to embody safe space. And I think that's why it's so important when I did share about ADAPT and why I make these points is that I do encourage other organizations to have employee resource groups or affinity groups where you do have that community built in, but know that we did it from a firm-wide level to maintain anonymity. I can't ever pronounce that word, so tell me if I said it wrong. The anonymous aspect of knowing that you're part of a larger group, that you're not being pinpointed as like the only disabled person in Baltimore, for example. which often can be the case as you're one of the few disabled people in an office. But as a collective, we have over 125 disabled self-identified members of ADAPT. And so I think that's what's really important to Mara's point about being excluded and yet finding ways to bring us back into the light and giving us the opportunity to really be the change makers within our own organizations. And then I also really like that in the very beginning, Barbara, you said, we cannot forget history. And I think it's so prevalent in our industry. Like I had said, we're so deadline driven. I know you architects and designers in the room or online listening are so used to being like, come on, let's go. It's got to get out by the end of the week, end of week. But we all have the power in our respective industries to say, pause, maybe we do need more time. Maybe we need to involve more important people like the end users that are using this space every single day. If that's what we need to do, if that's what you need to do, I encourage you to do it. I empower you to do that, is to speak up and speak out to include more. So that's the only thing I wanted to add. And everybody else shared so much great historical stuff that we got to remember to look back at our history so we keep moving forward in a positive way.
Yeah, I wanted to add one of the things I feel that I forgot to totally mention, but picking up on, Mara, your comment about not liking the word, or not always liking the word inclusive. I feel like it's not just about inclusive design, but about incisive design. Like when I'm trying to talk about Carolyn Lazard or Finnegan Shannon's interventions in these spaces, they're not about seamless integration, right? In fact, what makes them kind of radical is about the seams that they reveal in the current inaccessibility of spaces. So, I mean, it's not just hostile architecture versus not. I mean, to me, this is pushing against horizons of access or frames of access that people envision as good design, as inclusive design, as accessible design. And the piece that I forgot to bring up that I was going to bring up is John Lee Clark's piece that was in McSweeney's is called Against Access, which is a pretty radical claim. But one of the things that he says in that essay that I really like is, why is it that able-bodied people, or let's say non-disabled people, always assume that disabled people want to be included in their worlds and not the other way around? And so I actually think that some of these interventions that actually make things perhaps inconvenient for non-disabled people are actually potentially good design. I mean, that's why they don't want to install benches at galleries, because it's inconvenient and it takes up too much square footage, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm like, maybe if we think of access that way, as opposed to let's make the access features as invisible as possible, then that could tell us a lot, not only about the current inaccessibility of our world, but maybe make things better for everyone. Like the classic example is the curb cut. I'm assuming everyone here is familiar with the idea that curb cuts help more than just disabled people, right? Or more than just wheelchair users, et cetera. So maybe I want to propose something like that in terms of and I think that remote and hybrid just become really easy ways of not integrating disabled people in ways that are inconvenient.
Right. Again, I think that's an assumption that it's like the book, Why'd All the Black Kids Sit at the Same Table in the Cafeteria? It's like, well, because they want to, and you shouldn't assume because they're doing that it has anything to do with you even. Or making spaces accessible for everyone. Well, maybe I like the way that I communicate. I like the way that I exist. And why are we assuming that that has to be fixed? There's also a great choreographer, dancer, and I'm going to forget her name, but she dances with her wheelchair with such power and beauty, and she loves her wheelchair because it gives her speed and a different way of moving than other people. And I also think that's part of this conversation. I think I'm ready to open it up to questions from the audience.
Some things posted.
Yes.
I'll just say there's a great, Alice Shepard, maybe the person you're thinking of in Kinetic Light, is a fantastic group with many people who dance using wheelchairs in New York, and then there's Access Dance, just for people who want those references in the Bay Area.
Alice Shepherd's a really amazing thing. Okay, so do you want to, Christina, do you want to read some of the questions from online?
Sure, yeah, so we have a couple. The first one, I'd like to hear the panelists respond to the idea of providing choices for interventions and design solutions for the diversity of humans. The challenge of creating solutions to barriers is that what serves one person may not serve another effectively. How does the average designer know they are still serving a wide range of people who identify as disabled?
So that boils down to the last part of that question. How does the average designer know that they are
Still serving a wide range of people who identify as disabled.
right? This goes to a big question for designers, which is how can I design for everybody? You know, especially because and I'm not going to speak to this too much, but there's so many types of disability and multiple disabilities within one person that is a question that often comes up for architects and designers who are not disabled. How do I cover all of it? Any advice for designers? Jake has his hand raised.
I'll take a little bit of the weight off everybody else's shoulders on this question. I know when we talk about inclusive design, which I think Emily and Mara kind of talked about, inclusion can be controversial, but like a great example is like, I was born deaf, so was my brother, but the way we experience deafness are very different from each other. And we're still in the same family, still part of the same upbringing. So it goes to reiterate that disabled experiences are not a monolith. We are very vastly different as people. And so to answer the question, what I always advise architects, designers, etc., is to provide choice, autonomy, and what that provides is you give high seats versus low seats. You give all of those options. And Emily just rose a great point during her speech, which was the type of chair that works best for her, those types of disabilities that she outlined. We need to bring those into our spaces, right? If one disabled person brings something up, okay, put that on your list as things as now it's an option that you need to provide in that space, right? Because you can't just leave these little outliers all by themselves. They all have a reason for being. And that's the other piece that I wanted to integrate was, how does the average designer know what to do? And the biggest thing I always say is ask. There's groups everywhere. There's groups in every single city. There's advocates in every city. There's actually something we've been doing at Gensler in the Southeast region, especially in the DC office. They actually do this series that's done every month where it goes beyond the baseline, where they connect with a local vendor, a local manufacturer, or a local disability advocacy group, or something like a trauma-informed design group, and we bring them into the room to talk to architects and designers and have a two-way conversation. So that the question that you're bringing up in this conversation is kind of addressed in a group setting where everybody kind of interacts with each other. So that's another way I would encourage you to kind of bring this into your own practice is, why can't you bring in communities outside of your own that you don't necessarily work with every day to influence your work going forward? Hope that gives a little couple food for thoughts and seeds. I'll cede my time for that.
I would say, I just would recommend, if they haven't already spoken to your group, there's a cluster of people who've written great books on disability and design, sometimes more focused on product design than architecture, sometimes more on architecture, who have really explored universal versus critical versus inclusive design and what those things mean. And so, David, you mentioned Bess Williamson. I mentioned Amy Hamraie, Hamraie, Sarah Hendren, Graham Pullen. I would just say, as a shortcut, look at those books. The other thing I would want to say is, outside of the disability and design space, there are a lot of people in media studies who've looked at designing around digital media and the problems of how much design is going in to support these big media companies and their goals. So my colleague, Natasha Scholl, an absolutely brilliant medical and STS scholar, technical anthropologist, wrote a book called Addiction by Design about digital machine gambling in Las Vegas and all the architecture, sound design, carpet design, and the combinations of like architects, neurologists, psychologists, programmers that all came together to make these machines as addictive as possible. A lot of design goes into iPhones and their apps to make them as addictive as possible and to capture attention of people of many abilities, different kinds of abilities. What kind of calm design do we need to counter that? We can't just, right now we're like resorting to laws to take phones away from kids in schools. I'm a professor, so I think about this all the time. I don't see a counter movement to the like Las Vegas addiction by design, very successful movement. And there are a lot of people in my field who have worked on design serving tech interests.
Are there any questions from anybody in the physical audience? Yes. I'll repeat your question.
I'm partially sighted, and I found this to be quite text intensive. And I think had I done it on Zoom, I would have had an easier time because I really couldn't read any of the stuff that was up there. Also, in terms of touch tours, a number of museums do offer them for the partially sighted, but also the Museum of Modern Art offers them to children's groups, sighted children's groups. And I've been on a number of touch tours where the sighted onlookers just look at us very jealously, as if, what right do you have to touch the pieces of sculpture?
Those are great points. I also imagine because of the bright light on the screen here, it makes it actually even harder to read, even if you could. And also the captions are very small.
No, I debated doing it from home, but I thought appearing with a white cane would at least make me feel appropriate.
You are appropriate.
Do you want to repeat the question for the?
It wasn't really a question. It was more a statement that you have sight issues. I'm not going to say that the right way, but that you found it actually really hard to read the text on the screen because it was very text heavy. Is there something that can be done about that? Let me just ask.
I think just doing it on Zoom. We should give them.
Right on.
If the audience has a mic, the people on Zoom will hear what they say.
And then the other comment was that there are these touch tours that can be done in museums for people with sight issues that are the envy of other people.
But also children's groups.
Yeah. All right.
Also, children's groups in places like the Museum of Modern Art have access to touch tours.
Right. That's great. That forms a kind of literacy, I think, also.
And they're really wonderful.
Great.
Touching a piece of sculpture is very different from looking at it.
Right. David actually has a chapter in his book about blind children touching models of buildings to understand how the buildings look by actually feeling the details, which is a really great chapter. I think we should move on to another. Christina, is there another online question?
David raised his hand.
Before Barbara mentioned that chapter of my book, I mean, there's, especially in New York, but this is true of a lot of other large metropolitan, areas, but the history of touch tours and the use of the museum as a kind of outreach, educational outreach for various kids with physical or sensory disabilities. The Metropolitan Museum of Art and the American Museum of Natural History, both going back to the last decades of the 19th century, have had, and I have a slide, or I had a slide in my presentation for today, but just in the interest of time, I moved on. But it's of 3 children touching a tactile globe of the Earth, and the way that those kinds of tours for, in this case, blind children at schools in New York City, how it wasn't just about teaching or learning, but it was also about giving them the experience of being in a physical place that they would otherwise feel, and this would have been true, I mean, it may be true now, but it was certainly true 100 years ago, that these are spaces that weren't built for them, right? Because museums are about the visual and what's behind the velvet rope. And so the experience that you're describing, right, of going on a touch tour, right, and why sighted people are jealous is because you're getting to do something that is sort of against the grain, very similar to what Emily was describing. Like, it's a disruptive act. Like, oh my gosh, you're touching the, like the Rodin sculpture. You're not supposed to do that. And that's one of the stories of the modern, modernity, which is that it's a world about seeing, it's a world about hearing, and you're not supposed to touch other people, and you're not supposed to touch objects in museums. So the blind tour is like thwarting that and kind of saying, why shouldn't everyone have an opportunity to touch? But it's still seen as something that is exclusive for people, right, who are privileged. By the way, just because we're talking about it, about 10 years ago, I had an opportunity to go on a blind touch tour of the Houses of Parliament when I was in London. And they brought 10 of us into like the chambers, like where the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and we were told, if you weren't on this tour, you would never have access to this kind of inner sanctum. And so I took full advantage of that, and that's something I think that there should be more opportunities for that kind of thing.
Can I just add something really quickly to the earlier point about text and Zoom, which is I just had this like flashback of, we used to have iPads for people who needed CART on their, in closer proximity to where they're at. And I think that's just another thing that we just forgot, because it's, oh, you should just do it on Zoom, And I mean, I think there are these things, and that in itself was a hybrid space, because you would have the CART captioner who would drop a link, and then from there, it would beam it to your device. So I just wanted to mention that. It's just an observation.
Part of the amnesia that Mara, or that you...
Like, I forgot.
Right. I don't know, maybe one more question, and then I think we can wrap it up. Christina, is there another one from online?
I was interested in Jake's point on the access friction with masks for people who lip read, and connecting that to Emily's work on people with ME/CFS. As a person with those conditions, I have found that in-person spaces have become inaccessible to me because of the lack of mandatory masking or testing. COVID-19 infections can lead to long COVID, which can overlap with those conditions, creating a new population of people with disability. For people with pre-existing conditions, oh no, the Zoom just restarted. I remember the end of the question though. I mean, it's basically essentially asking that question of, if you have a pre-existing condition, how can you still participate in in-person events without relying fully on the virtual environment? And I will say there were a number of questions saying that just a lot of times the virtual environment is now this default to not being exposed, but it really falls short of people's expectations and needs. Okay. So that's the gist, I think.
You guys want to comment on that, and that'll be the final question?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that's one thing that I was thinking about and trying to figure out if I had time to fit into this presentation. There's the issue of access friction that Jake brought up, and there are all sorts of tools to deal with masking, or I shouldn't say all sorts of, actually. There are a minimal number of tools to deal with that access friction between deaf folks and masking. And even my university tried to say that we couldn't get a live CART captioner for a deaf student, and we just needed to mask and somehow figure it out and use this online system that was really inadequate. So I think we don't think enough about how to resolve questions of access friction. And I'll also say, in terms of interior architecture, I think there's a lot to be said about healthy buildings. And I'm someone with pretty serious mold allergy, and the same types of systems, HVAC systems that help mold allergy also help significantly reduce long COVID. So again, yeah, I think, or sorry, the transmission of COVID rather, and by extension, long COVID. So yeah, I think we need to think a lot more expansively about what that means, number one. And number two, I think this is implicit in the way the question was framed, at least as I interpreted it, which is that I think we've forgotten about COVID precautions too, because we just say hybrid, also extremely inadequate, and a deficit of the imagination that I think is lamentable.
Okay, and on that high note, I think we should end so that you can all talk to each other. I want to thank all the participants so much for this, for your insights on a very abstract notion for an architectural presentation. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank the audience for coming, both online and in person. Thank you.
And thank you, Barbara, for organizing.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.